Hi there. My name is Mike Hochleutner. It's nice to be with you today. I want to talk to you briefly about my 3-month application prep plan. This is as I step back and work with clients and think about the things that you ought to be prioritizing about 3 months out from the application deadline. I've got 5 tips that I think can be helpful. I'll note briefly that I've done some other sessions, including a 6-month personal development plan, which gives a little bit of insight when you've got a little bit more time before an application is due to actually work on some projects or work on some initiatives that can be part of your application. I've also done a 4-month prep plan that focuses on the research you can do on the specific schools and programs that you might be applying to. So those are a little bit of background. Just a little bit of context about me. I spent about 18 years working at Stanford's Graduate School of Business in a couple of different roles and phases, including a period where I was executive director of the school's Center for Leadership Development and Research, helped to launch the MBA leadership curriculum, oversaw a number of student programs and initiatives, and then I took over the mid-career program called the Stanford MSx program. And in that role, became a student essentially of admissions and had to overhaul the admissions process for the MSx program, and then later merged that with the MBA admissions office and instituted a number of efforts that really brought those two programs, the admissions process, together in large respects. And so was involved in various efforts on that front and got to see essentially the inside workings of both the MBA and the MSx admissions process. For the last couple of years, I've been working as a consultant to organizations focused on AI initiatives and essentially leadership development efforts that they've been undertaking to manage how they implement AI within their organizations. And I've been working with clients that are looking to apply to business schools. And I've found there's actually some synergies between those two that I'll bring up briefly in a little bit. But when I work with people, they tend to focus on admissions as tactical effort. They look at an application as a series of different parts, and they look to optimize each of those parts, like the resume, the letters of recommendation, essays, and the like. And I like to encourage people to step back a little bit and try to think a little bit more strategically about what it is that they're trying to accomplish when it comes to the admissions process. First of all, keep in mind that admissions is a means to an end, right? It's not the end goal to get in a business school, right? The end goal is to develop yourself, learn in a way that you're going to become more capable as a leader, able to take on larger management leadership challenges, able to make a greater impact in the organizations or the sectors in which you work. And so I try to approach admissions with that point of view as being a step on that journey. And hopefully if you approach it in that way, I think it can help people actually manage some of the anxiety and actually approach the process in a way that is not only beneficial to you creating some momentum for yourself in that longer term direction, but also tends to be correlated with better results in the admissions process itself. And so in that spirit, I'd like to kick off the tips that I have to offer, which is to really think about the audience and the admission criteria that each of the schools is really looking at. And it helps to understand essentially where that audience is coming from, who are their key stakeholders, why do they make the decisions that they make, and why do they choose the criteria that they choose. And business schools are mission-driven organizations. Generally, business schools are part of a broader university. They don't just have a teaching mission. They have also a research mission, a knowledge creation mission. And they tend to be very academic-minded institutions. Business schools, in many respects, have been fighting a decades-long fight within universities for credibility, that they're not just about the trades, but they're a serious academic enterprise. And so the admissions office essentially is underneath the faculty, typically in a business school setting. When I was running admissions at Stanford, my key stakeholders in some respects was not only the student body and essentially people feeling that they were part of a great class, but it was often the faculty members. And the first judges, I would say, or audience that would get to test the product that I created. And essentially, when you put together a cohort, when you admit people into a program, that cohort is like the product that you're producing. And the faculty are the first ones that get to kind of test it, kick the tires, have a sense of how effective and how successful you've been in putting together a strong product. And I just remember that feeling at the end of, as we would close the first term of a new class and starting to see the feedback come in from the faculty in terms of how they felt that the class was performing in the classroom. And most of the time it was positive and good results, but sometimes there would just be that tough question about, how did this person get admitted? And I'd have to go back and kind of replay a little bit the narrative around some of the choices that we made. But it was there was a certain edge to making sure that the people that we admitted were up to the expectations of the particular audiences, the stakeholders that we were trying to serve. And it's also useful to understand who that audience is ultimately serving. Now, I do reference here that you should consider yourself as a sort of a key audience member for this process for you, because ultimately at the end of the day, whatever you put into your application, this is going to be a significant amount of work and effort on your part. You want to make sure that the product that you're producing in this admissions process is something that you feel good about, that you feel proud of, that you feel a sense of ownership for. I've seen far too many people over the years, especially when I was working in admissions, that would put together an application and 6 months or a year later, they'd acknowledge essentially, hey, I just said what I thought the admissions office wanted to hear. And I think that not only is that less likely to result in a positive result, although I'm not going to pretend that there weren't cases where people were admitted who said that, but I found that the people in the program, I worked with students who would be there for a year, for 2 years, and when they would show up on campus and they hadn't really been truthful with themselves, if they hadn't been authentic in their applications, I tended to see that sometimes they feel a little bit adrift. They wouldn't have as clear a sense of purpose, of mission as students in the program. And I have to tell you, that's really important. This is a massive investment that you make when you're talking about taking 2 years of dedicating your life, giving up a salary, paying a significant tuition fee. You want to make sure that you go into business school with a clear sense of priorities, an ability to say no to a lot of things so that you can really focus on the things that are going to be give you the most leverage and create the most momentum for yourself in terms of reaching the goals that you want to reach. And so go through this process and make sure that you're putting yourself as one of the audience members that you're trying to speak to and, in a sense, answer to in this process. Now, in terms of the criteria that schools use, I put a couple of examples here, Stanford and Harvard, just to give you a flavor. But most schools put admission criteria somewhere on their website and talk about it. And I'll say Stanford put these criteria: intellectual vitality, demonstrated leadership potential, personal qualities and contributions. And having worked there, I can say these are the criteria by which they tried to judge applications. Now, of course, going from some simple words to how you actually interpret that and how you measure that, there's a whole series of steps that we would have to go through. And I would often be in meetings with 2 or 3 other admissions office staff, and we would be in significant disagreement about the relative ratings that we would give individual applicants. Even though we were using the same criteria, even though we read the same applications, there can be quite a bit of differences of opinion in terms of how those things are interpreted. But it's helpful to at least be aiming at the criteria that a school is judging you by. And so what I use shorthand to help people who are applying to multiple schools is to try to break this down into 3 general buckets. And if you look at the Stanford and the Harvard criteria, they can fit pretty well into these buckets. And as I've looked at other schools' criteria as well, I find that they generally can fit into these buckets. And having worked in admissions for over a decade, these are really the 3 questions that anybody who's working in admissions is trying to answer as they're going through your application, right? First of all, the academic component is important. Are you going to be a good student? These are graduate schools. They're high caliber academic environments. You'll often hear students say, oh, the classes don't really matter. Doing the academics really doesn't matter. It's all about who you meet and getting a good job. But I can tell you from an admissions office perspective, that's absolute nonsense, okay? They don't look at it that way. They want people that are going to take academics seriously, that are going to create a culture and environment where people take learning seriously. They're looking for people that they don't have to worry about or feel that there's a risk of academic struggle or academic failure. They want you to struggle, but they want you to struggle on the sort of high end of how do you become a better leader, not trying to do some debt to equity ratio calculation for basic finance class. They want to make sure that people come in with the academic skills, the quantitative skills, the communication skills in order to be effective in an academic environment and really push the thinking of their classmates and other members of the community. Second, they want to know that you're going to be essentially a good alum, or you're going to be someone who goes out and represents the school well when you're in leadership roles in organizations or in your industry or in your community. Are you going to be able to have some positive impact? So they're looking to assess essentially your leadership potential. And one of the things that we used to say at Stanford was the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And particularly when we would be assessing someone's leadership, we would be looking for evidence of leadership behaviors, actual things that people had done. And this is something that when you talk to people about the interviews that business schools do, they're typically behavioral based questions. Tell me about a time when you had to deal with a poorly performing team. Tell me about a time when you had to deal with a tough negotiation. They want to hear examples, tangible examples of things that you've done that are indicative of leadership behaviors. And when you think about what is leadership, at a fairly basic level, and I ran a leadership center at Stanford, I can talk for hours and hours about what is leadership, but at a very basic level, it's where you're trying to accomplish things through not just individual action, but through some collective actions, having to engage other people in reaching the goals that you have or that you aspire to accomplish. It's essentially the ability to pull together in some coordinated way the efforts of multiple people. And there's a lot of different behaviors, inspiring people, communicating effectively, collaborating, sometimes maybe even coercing, having a toolkit in terms of being able to leverage the talents, steer the motivations of other people. And so they want to see evidence of that. And the more that you can tell in terms of stories and give examples, generally the better. I would say admission readers were like bloodhounds going through applications, trying to find essentially examples and evidence of these leadership behaviors. And then the third dimension is what I call the personal cultural dimension. It's really looking at finding people that have a balance of being able to fit in, being able to thrive in a business school cohort, and at the same time having something unique that they can contribute. In a business school setting, you don't want an entire class of everybody's from consulting and they've lived in New York, right? That kind of gets a little bit boring and it's a little stale in terms of what you can learn from a group like that. You want a more diverse set of backgrounds, people that have worked in different industries, that have been in large organizations, small organizations, that have worked in different sectors, have grown up in different environments, that come from different cultural perspectives or backgrounds. You want to give people the opportunity to learn from a diverse range of different people. A lot of learning that happens in business school is essentially by osmosis, as I think about it. You have classmates. This classmate's really good in terms of public speaking and creating a sense of charisma. This person is really good at dealing with tense conflict situations and being able to diffuse them. This person is really good at creating a sense of shared purpose or vision. And over time, you almost unconsciously pick up on little skills, little ways of thinking about things, and it helps you to build a more resilient toolkit. And so these are the things that, from an admissions perspective, you want to make sure that you're taking into account essentially as you're evaluating applications. So next, let's talk about where you are 3 months out from submitting your application. And this is where this presentation is a little bit different than when I talk about when you're 6 months out, right? Because 6 months out, you've got a little bit of time to still be working on some projects, to demonstrate some accomplishments, to get some results essentially that you can talk about in your application. 3 months out, you really have to start making some choices and recognize that there's some things that are kind of set in stone when you're putting together your application. Obviously, You can't go back in time and change where you went to school or what you studied. You're not going to go back and change where you've worked along the way. Maybe there's still time to retake a GMAT or GRE test, but in most cases, people have taken their test, and short of spending 40 hours a week for several weeks studying, you're probably not going to retake it and get much of a better score than what you have. And so you have to look at essentially what are the components of your application that are pretty much set. What are the things that you still have a little bit of discretion to control, and come to terms with that. Essentially be honest with yourself, have some self-awareness to recognize that, hey, maybe there's a few things here in terms of my GPA, in terms of a test score, in terms of some period maybe where I was a little bit, had a little bit of a setback or a challenge in terms of my work situation, where maybe this isn't the bright spot that I think I need to have to be successful in the application process. So one is just recognizing that and being ready to figure out how to address it. But the good news is I want to tell you that every successful application is going to have some blemishes, right? It's going to have some areas where people don't necessarily live up to the sense of hype or the sense of perfection that you imagine the best applicants have. And that's okay. In fact, that's human, and it can be a very valuable part of your story. I would say that generally when you read an application, everything looks just perfect. Someone's got the 4.0 GPA, they almost a perfect test score, and they've worked at all the best companies. They've worked at Google and Goldman Sachs or something like that. There's just a natural sense of suspicion. There's just a natural sense of, okay, this is a little too good to be true. And unless that individual can demonstrate a certain humanity and humility in their application, I can only speak for Stanford, but I would say I saw a lot of people with those, what looked like the perfect resume, be rejected. I think all business schools look to multi-layered and a little bit more of a complex person that is really the more interesting dynamic. Having read more applications than I can count. If you put yourself in the shoes of someone who's reading 15 to 20 applications in a day, when you break that down, what you're talking about is they have about 15 to 20 minutes to touch an application and open up the file and start looking at the different pieces, thinking about everything from the essay, the resume, letters of recommendation. You're just trying to absorb a lot of information in a short amount of time. And by 2:00 in the afternoon, it's cognitive overload. And honestly, I really struggled sometimes to just continually tell myself, this person put a lot of work into this application. I owe it to them to try to focus, try to absorb as much as possible. But I can tell you, some things made it easier and some things made it harder. And the people that just gushed about all their accomplishments and how great they were and all their leadership strengths and really tried to present themselves as the perfect avatar of a remarkable leader and a great student put me to sleep. I just read through that. It's like a bad version of the hero's journey. If you're familiar with the Joseph Campbell ideal of what's the great story archetype, it's the hero's journey. It's someone who goes out and sets off on a mission and encounters struggle. And it was those stories, it was the essays where someone starts out by talking about where they failed, talking about where they screwed up, talking about when they were at a low point, that pulled me in, that I found myself absorbed in their story and wanting to hear more and figure out, like, how does this end? Where is the resolution to this conflict? Every great application has to have some conflict in it. And so whether you think about it as the hero's journey, whether you think about it as I have to confront my shadow, that sort of Jungian idea, figuring out where are the gaps, where are the elements where I can create that tension, create that sense of here's where I struggle. After all, the only reason to apply to school is that you have something to learn, that there's an opportunity to get better. And so think of this as a part of one of the most important parts, honestly, of your application. And coming up with identifying those so that you can start to build kind of your narrative and story that incorporates that. And too often I find that the natural inclination that people have is to try to avoid that and just try to focus on what's great, what's perfect, what makes them look good. So the next step, once you've identified some of those gaps, you're going to want to try to build your narrative. You're going to want to try to figure out what's the core idea that I can build into my application that someone who, as I said, is reading dozens of applications a day, hundreds of applications over the course of an admissions cycle, was going to be able to stick with them. And if it's more than 2 or 3 sentences, that's probably too much. Honestly, when I was in heavy reading mode of reading applications, a day after I read an application, I probably forgot at least 50% of what was in that application. And by a week later, I'd be lucky if I could really remember 10 to 15% of what was in an application. Obviously, I had notes, and obviously we would essentially rate the applications at the time that we read them. But when it comes time to review and make decisions, especially for people that are somewhere close to that decision line, it's priceless if the person who read your application or the people that read your application have some narrative in their head, have some idea in their head is, oh, this is the person who was from this industry but made a pivot into that industry, or this is the person who came from a background with a family business but chose to go off and do something entrepreneurial. You want to make sure that you've got that little bit of a narrative story that you can tell. And this is where I'll do a little bit of a sidebar. I think that I found that AI, LLMs can be really valuable tools in building the narrative, building the story that you're trying to tell. And they're not going to tell it for you. They're not going to write an essay. They're not going to come up with the narrative. But in a back and forth exchange, these can be very valuable tools to help you develop the idea, to tighten the way that you describe it, the way that you think about it, the way that you can convey it to an admissions committee. And so this is something I've been working on a lot. I'm not going to go into too much detail today about some of the pros and cons or some of the particular techniques, but just know that it's an option to pursue. There's a lot that's been said about AI use in admissions, and schools are coming out with various policies where they seem to be saying perhaps that you shouldn't be using AI in the admissions process. And having worked at Stanford, even up until a period after ChatGPT had become pretty widespread, I can say that's nonsense. Okay, they want to discourage bad use. They want to discourage lazy use. Certainly, if you're having AI write essays or write entire sections of your application for you, not only is that unethical, but it's probably disastrously ineffective. It's not going to be able to produce something that is really representative of you, and it's probably not going to be something that's original enough, specific enough that is going to represent you well. And so don't think of it as a way to cheat or get ahead. Think about it as a way to sharpen your thinking, to challenge you to produce something better. And so that's a tool to use. It's something that I've been working with quite a bit. Happy to discuss options that I've been working with that can be useful tools for you. So tip 4 is to think about how you can demonstrate that you can be a great community member. And you do that by showing that you can essentially take initiative responsibly. As much as business schools are about a curriculum, right? They've got a core curriculum, and there's a certain set of courses, a certain set of academic units that you need to get through in order to graduate with a degree. I used to think about essentially the business school experience as a human capital ecosystem, right? It's much broader, truly, than just a series of classes that you take where each one builds on the last. It's a hodgepodge of courses, of engaging with guest speakers, working on projects with classmates, attending various events with people from different industries who are going to share a variety of different perspectives and learnings. And it's important to come into a business school ready to be very active and leaning in. If you think about having hundreds of students that are part of a cohort, typically at the top schools, they're going to have very diverse needs, academic needs. They're going to have very diverse career goals. And you want to create an environment where essentially all these people can be pursuing their own goals with some common shared goals, but a lot of individual specific goals, but do it in a way that is kind of mutually beneficial and creates an environment where a lot of people can get a lot of different needs met. And the best way to do this is to actively engage before you've even submitted an application. Show that essentially you can behave as a effective student, even without being a student. All of these campuses are open to the public. You can visit the campus if you want. All of these schools have a lot of online access to current students and activities that are happening on campus, events, and look for ways that you can engage with either current students or members of the community in some way that is helpful to you in terms of getting answers to questions that you might have and really digging in to build your understanding of the campus culture and the environment, the ecosystem. Make sure that it really is a place that can serve your needs in terms of your career goals and learning goals. And if you're able to do so, if there's any way where you can actually contribute in some way, that is something that can really put you ahead of most people that are in the applicant pool. Examples of this would be maybe you've got some career-related contacts that some current students could find valuable in terms of their career search. Maybe there's a class project where they're trying to get access to a particular company or insights within a particular industry that you have some insight or a network that you can tap. Maybe there's some data that you have that some students would find valuable. It's hard to know exactly what you might have of value without engaging with some members of the community. And it can be intimidating. It can be challenging. I'm not saying that this is easy, but it is something that I've seen be extremely effective. Essentially, when someone is submitting an application and when it's clear that they have already built a little bit of a network, that they've already had some experiences with members of the community, students, alumni, faculty, where they've shown that they can be accepted, that they have an ability to carry on productive relationships and conversations with people. It just removes a whole series of questions about, hey, is this person going to be able to fit in effectively? Are they going to be able to contribute in a significant way? And so think of this as something that really can help set you apart if you're able to do it effectively. And the last tip here is, I say take your time, but really what I mean by this is manage your time. Think about your time strategically. Putting together a business school application, if you think about it as just, oh, it's this task I have to do and I need to submit this application, it's all about getting admitted. It can feel a little bit tedious. In a sense, you want to be efficient and cut down the time. But if you think about it as a significant investment in your personal development and essentially clarifying a sort of a path for yourself and building a vision for yourself in terms of where you want to be in 3 or 5 or 10 years, it's a significant time investment where you can start to feel like, hey, the more I put into this, the more I'm going to get out of it. And that's really, I think, the better way to look at the admissions process. And with 3 months out, my advice would be to work to get to a place where a month from now, 2 months out from the deadline, you've got a draft application. And it doesn't have to be polished. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to feel all that great about whatever essays you have or sort of interactions you've had with your recommenders, but you want to be in a place where essentially the sort of the core elements of the application, your work history, your academic history, your letters, not your letters of recommendation, but your resume, your essays, you've got that first draft, because it's in that second, third, fourth iteration where you really see significant improvements. I see improvements with the clients that I work with. And so give yourself essentially eight weeks or so before the deadline where you've got at least that first thing. You can feel it's terrible, but if you've got something as a starting point, it becomes a lot easier. It removes a barrier of having a blank page in front of you to think about an essay. If you've got something, even if you're going to rewrite it from scratch, I find that it just kind of removes a certain block that people have about putting together content for their application. So work towards that. I'm going to do a couple sessions, one next month and one in August, that focus on some things that you can be doing with 2 months out or 1 month out. Again, if you tried to attend my session earlier and weren't able to hear me, I'm sorry about that. Hopefully this has been helpful and gives you a quick snapshot of the tips that I wanted to walk through. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always happy to have a brief 15-minute intro call with people, even if they're not planning on engaging a coach or consultant. I'm happy to give a little bit of advice. I find it, and the reason I do this work is because I missed, honestly, the interactions that I had with applicants and when I was working at Stanford, and feel that I have a lot of experience that makes it easy to sometimes identify low-hanging fruit for people and in terms of some things that can help them be more effective in the admissions process, even if it only takes a few minutes of my time. And I'm happy to give that. I feel it's, in some sense, I've been lucky to enjoy the work that I've done. And if I can find ways to give back with little effort, I'm happy to do that. So otherwise, I hope this has been useful to you, and good luck in your admissions journey. I hope to see you at a great school a year from now. All right, take care.